So hi everyone. I hope everyone's doing okay. I can tell that everyone can hear me all right. Um, I hope everyone's doing great. All things considered, in these sort of ongoing pandemic times. Um, I'm of course sorry that I couldn't give this presentation in person. I wish I was actually meeting everyone, but I suppose but by being at home, I can sort of do the talk in my sweatpants and next to my cats and so on. So isn't the worst thing. Before I say anything else, I want to thank David and the other conveners for their invitation for me to speak at IHR. As I was just saying, this is the first time I've really tried to bring these ideas together for my first chapter, let alone present them to any broader audience. So I really appreciate the opportunity and look forward especially to chatting more about the ideas in the Q&A. Okay, so. I don't have all the time in the world, so I'll more or less jump right in. But before that, I want to give everyone just a quick sense of how my presentation will proceed. So first, I'll say a bit about how I imagine this material fitting into the broader dissertation project and what exactly that project entails. Then I'll situate this notion of hard-heartedness in the context I think that matters for our purposes. Next, I'll discuss the impact of the Scottish Enlightenment tradition on conceptions of how the state should address poverty and think about the social status of the poor. Then I'll turn our attention to Smith and what I term the dialectic of sympathy on the one hand, and this notion of a sort of burden of inclusion on the other hand. And then I'll conclude with an analysis of how, more precisely, Smith, at least to my mind, inaugurates a framework within which both contemporary and later thinkers articulated the moral foundations of economic liberalism, foundations which I argue cannot be divorced from the question of the poor's relationship to the state and society. If there is some time at the very end, I can say a little bit about where I think the dissertation will go in the next chapters, though as things stand, all that's very uncertain. Okay, so what exactly am I up to in my dissertation? So as David noted, it's provisionally titled Hating the Poor, Poverty, Democracy, and the Politics of Human Nature. And in it, I basically want to try to accomplish three things. First, although intellectual historians such as Professor Jones, who's here in the audience, social historians and sociologists have all contributed significantly to our understandings of poverty and disparate conceptions of the poor, political theory has been virtually silent on the topic. I'm not exactly sure why, but my sense is that theorists have, perhaps in a way, let themselves be blinded by questions of capitalism, of economic inequality, and now more recently, neoliberalism, almost as if poverty is in a sense reducible to any of these other political economic formations. Now, of course, we not want to suggest that capitalism, economic inequality, and neoliberalism aren't important political economic phenomena, but my dissertation hopes to show why the specificity of poverty and the poor matters, and why it matters, on the other hand, not simply for questions of distributive justice. And so in this way, I know I'm certainly sort of talking around Rawls's idea of the least well-off members of society in virtue of speaking about and focusing on the poor, but I want to avoid subsuming the sort of question of poverty under the sort of broader rubric of questions of distributive justice. Oh, oops. So centering poverty. Second, my dissertation aims to take seriously the effects of negative stereotypes of the poor and negative attitudes towards them in terms of how we understand citizenship. And so in this way, I hope to look sort of behind the veil of claims about the qualifications that regulate citizenship, especially as authors I think in the 19th century began to make claims about, began to claim that the right to work and rights to the whole produce of one's labor sort of maybe or were part and parcel of citizenship. Finally, I want to show that behind the veil of these sorts of claims are conceptions either of the human nature of the poor simpliciter or of the sense in which questions of philosophical anthropology matter for how we think about the poor's inclusion into the state and society. I'll be discussing some of this latter point in what follows, but this in some ways is the kicker, I think, of my project, not least because of the fact that by the 1980s, and definitely in the 1990s in the US at least, the poor's impoverished condition was said to be a consequence of certain cultural deficiencies. And so we should think here about ideas of the sort of culture of poverty, the whole notion of a welfare queen, and this sense that the very poor belong to a so-called underclass. Interrogating the transition from the sort of philosophical anthropology of the poor to the culture of poverty will thus be an important component of my project, along with clarifying along the way the various, and I think in some cases, competing conceptions of human nature vis-a-vis the poor. And so although the sorts of negative stereotypes and attitudes that we find in the 80s and the 90s, and still I think in certain respects see today, have a number of historical antecedents, the important one for our purposes lies in what we can sort of loosely call the mercantilist tradition of early modern political economy. Smith's criticisms of mercantilism are, I think, pretty well known, and we owe it to him, I think, for the very term mercantilist. But his reaction to their many schemes for disciplining the poor and mobilizing the poor to work have received far less attention. Yet, when Smith invokes hard-heartedness, I argue he does so partly as commentary on that mercantilist approach. And so here's how Smith describes hard-heartedness, and this is in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Quote, "The wretch whose misfortune call upon our compassion feels with what reluctance we are likely to enter into his sorrow, and therefore proposes his grief to us with fear and hesitation. He even smothers the half of it, and is ashamed, upon account of this hard-heartedness of mankind, to give vent the fullness of his affliction." From the outset, I think it's worth emphasizing that whenever Smith talks about wretches, he almost always means poor wretches. And so it's the poor who feel the need to suppress their misfortunes. I argue that a key example of the purported hard-heartedness of mankind can be gleaned from the way mercantilists tended to describe the poor's habits and manners, and how they use these descriptions to justify harsh treatment of the poor. So for some very quick background, though mercantilism has been criticized, I think quite rightly, as a woefully vague, overbroad term, generally those authors who fall under the label are committed to the idea that the best way of generating national wealth or national prosperity is for states to behave in an aggressively competitive manner with trade partners and ensure what they call a favorable balance of trade. That is, a favorable balance between the amount of goods and specie exported versus imported. This latter idea was predicated on their belief that wealth was defined by money, and so the idea that it was in a state's best interest to amass as much specie as possible. As an aside, this sort of focus on the interests of the state was connected for mercantilists to this broader idea of reason of state, which was another idiom at play in the 16th and 17th centuries, 18th century as well. But this is, I think, less important for our purposes. More importantly, mercantilists thus emphasized increasing domestic production for the sake of foreign trade, and for this reason believed the increasing number of paupers throughout the middle parts of the 16th century and up until the 18th century could be directed toward production. As Joyce Appleby puts it, the poor were viewed by mercantilists as a productive resource that could be tapped to foster production and hence grow national wealth. Yet for authors who include prominent names like Bernard Mandeville and Thomas Munn, the poor could only be tapped in this way if they were first transformed into productive subjects. Indeed, beyond being accused of carrying disease and increasing crime, the poor and thus poverty was considered a problem because the poor lacked the requisite habits and manners necessary for participating in England's domestic economy. Mercantilists thus denigrated the poor as being profligate, prone to drunkenness and licentiousness, bad at parenting, you see that here and there, and above all else, lazy or indolent. And so as Foucault emphasizes in Madness and Civilization, Rise in this period thus proposed houses of correction and other disciplinary institutions whose express purpose was inculcating better habits among the poor. These proposals were often coupled with calls to restrict access to alehouses and keep wages low, even if the price of goods was increasing. But in terms of the harshness of treatment, it is quite hard, I think, to exaggerate just how severe some of the punishments were. Excuse me. And so per the Beggars Act of 1598, paupers caught begging were subject, quote, to being stripped naked from the middle upwards and openly whipped until their body be bloody. In the Beggars Act of 1536, the Beggars Act of 1536 prescribed cutting off an ear for those paupers caught begging outside of their parish multiple times. And I believe there's another piece of earlier legislation that even prescribed death by hanging for repeat offenders. Analyzing these proposals and the attitudes behind them led Edgar Furness to conclude that, quote, In all its many aspects, the labor theory of the day gave evidence that the thought of the theorist was tinctured by an element of bitterness, a feeling of resentment against the lower orders, for the immoral conflict of a people, the English people that is, who permitted evil habits to conflict with the performance of a duty vitally important to the welfare of the state. That duty, of course, being contributing by way of labor to the production, and so growing national wealth. But as scholars such as Daniel Baugh and A.W. Coates have noted, these attitudes toward the poor began to shift roughly around the middle parts of the 18th century as Scottish Enlightenment thinkers began making their sort of key innovations both in political economy and moral philosophy. And so along with the physiocrats in Cantillon in France, as well as Fernando Galiani of Italy, the Scots contributed significantly to the transformation of political economy from its inchoate state in the 16th century and 17th centuries to the veritable science we now recognize it as. Now, crucially, the science of political economy for the Scots was predicated on the science of man, and thus from the very beginning involved questions of philosophical anthropology. Now, to be sure, some mercantilist writers hinted at the idea that the poor's bad habits could be traced to deficiencies in their human nature. As Cosmo Orsi points out with respect to Thomas Munn, quote, Munn's understanding of labor supply, that penury and want make a people wise and industrious, rested upon pre-analytical assumptions concerning the human nature of the poor and their motivations, all leading to the conclusion that once their most pressing needs were satisfied, workers would sink into idleness, excess, immorality, and riots. And as we see in this quote from William Temple, quote, that idleness is the consequence of cheap living may be gathered from a knowledge of human nature alone. Mankind are naturally so fond of ease and indolence that they will not labor while they have the means of idleness in their power. However, I argue that it wasn't until the Scottish contribution that conceptualizing human nature became, in a way, a precondition for constructing the moral basis of political economy and theorizing the problem of poverty. And so beginning in part with Francis Hutcheson, but more prominently in Hume Smith, the Scots mark a kind of sympathetic turn in thinking about how the state should deal with poverty and the poor. Now, there are two caveats here that I should sort of mention from the outset. The first is that it's hard to count Hutcheson as part of this turn as such, notwithstanding his enormous influence on Hume and Smith's moral philosophy. Because as we see, he in fact thought that perpetual slavery was the best means of disciplining the poor. As he writes in A System of Moral Philosophy, quote, and yet perhaps no law could be more effectual to promote general industry than making perpetual slavery of this sort the ordinary punishment of such idle vagrants. Second, I don't mean to suggest that when Smith when Hume and Smith think about sympathy and the poor, that they thought that benevolence should always be extended to the poor. This is because for them, sympathy and benevolence don't exactly mean the same thing. And so while we might be able to say that there was a kind of sympathetic turn, it's not exact. I don't think it's exactly true to say that there was a sort of benevolent turn. But regardless, they recognize that how we treat the poor depends on how relations of sympathy operate, and that these relations inform the political economic prescriptions offered to ameliorate the poor's condition. And so with Hume, we see an acknowledgement of the bitterness and resentment often expressed toward the poor. Hume writes, quote, nothing has a greater tendency to give us an esteem for any person than his power and riches, or contempt than his poverty and meanness. But for Hume, these sentiments pertain to sympathy only insofar as they demonstrate our tendencies to prefer feeling the pleasures of wealth that we associate with the possession of wealth. So the sense that we can perceive in the wealthy the power they have to sort of engage in certain kinds of economic activity, buy the things they want. There's a certain freedom that comes with the possession of wealth that Hume thinks we're able to identify as a pleasure when we witness a poor person, a wealthy person. Now, the other side, these words about poverty more so pertain to the fact that we feel displeasure on the other hand, when in a way bearing witness to their condition. And so again, we feel the pleasure the rich feel because we can imagine the power the riches produce, whereas we can also imagine the despair poverty enacts. And so beyond being a function of our moral psychology, or rather beyond articulating these tendencies as a function of our moral psychology, Hume doesn't say much else beyond about our tendencies to hate the poor, to express towards them hard-heartedness. And so for this, I argue that we have to turn to Adam Smith. And so, as mentioned, this is where Smith comes in. And this line is basically, and this line here, which I just produced, is really what has kind of guided my reading of Smith so far, and really what kind of inspired me to consider this a good starting point for my dissertation, where Smith writes, quote, "This disposition to admire and almost worship the rich and the powerful, and to despise, or at least to neglect, persons of poor and meek condition, though necessary both to establish and maintain the distinction of ranks and the order of society, is at the same time the greatest and most universal cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments." So clearly this line mirrors what we just saw in Hume, but Smith treats this feature of our moral psychology as part and parcel of a critique of modern commercial society. And so in some ways, I argue that Smith finds himself here between Rousseau, whom he alleged was too Republican in his review, in the Edinburgh Review of the Second Discourse, and the other Scots who shared his intellectual and biographical affinities with Hutcheson and Hume. And so as scholars such as Roland Meek and Ishvan Hunt have shown, contemporary Scots such as Lord Kames and John Miller were also concerned with articulating the origins of distinctions and ranks, and how these distinctions formed the basis of political and social authority, in contrast to the earlier Lockean kind of social contract picture of how political authority is established. Adam Ferguson is also worth mentioning here, not least because of his own affinities with Rousseau. I believe someone was referred to him as the kind of Scottish Rousseau, but he operates, as I understand it, with a different understanding of history, and so not exactly the so-called sort of stadial or conceptual history that we see at work in Miller, Kames, and Smith. On the other hand, Smith's reasons for acknowledging the historical development of ranks are decidedly Rousseauian, for he acknowledges their development to draw attention to the corrupt state of modern commercial society. Even if the desire for esteem drives us to engage in commercial activity, thus fostering economic growth, its consequences on society certainly troubled Smith, not least because, as Dan Lubin has shown, the desire for esteem can quickly transform into the desire of domination, a desire Rousseau was, of course, also keen to unpack, as Michael McClendon has even more recently argued in his recent book. And while some scholars have framed the concomitant treatment of the poor in terms of their desire to avoid shame, I think it makes better sense to think of how they're treated in terms of hard-heartedness. Indeed, hard-heartedness stems precisely from the disposition to hate the poor or render them invisible. And so this sort of feeling that the sort of impartial spectator might not want to enter into the feelings and sentiments of the poor is precisely because of this hard-heartedness that I argue is a consequence of this disposition. It's also worth noting, just as an aside, that the depictions of how the poor are rendered invisible are some of the most powerful passages, I think, in Smith. And as it happens, they appear both in the Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, almost with the same phrasing. But this disposition that Smith mentions, I argue, is on display among the mercantilist authors with whom we began, and Smith conceives of it as a pervasive sentiment in modern commercial society. Moreover, unlike Hume, Smith also highlights the severity of the poor's condition. Loosely anticipating contemporary discussions of the poverty trap, he notes that street porters, a group whom Marx, by the by, will later classify as part of the lumpen proletariat, he notes that street porters rarely ever overcome their poverty. Furthermore, Smith thinks poverty pressures many of the poor to engage in criminal activity. So if you look at his analysis of the disbanding of feudal retainers in the Elizabethan period, he notes that many of them turn toward criminality. And he also argues that poverty creates discrete obstacles to child rearing. Finally, as numerous scholars have emphasized, Smith argues that focusing on simple repetitive tasks, such as, for example, working in a pin factory, dulls the minds of poor industrial laborers, causing them to lose the ability to engage in rational conversations, and see beyond their own individual interests to consider the interests of society. And so I argue that part of Smith's sympathetic turn involves rebutting key mercantilist presuppositions about the poor and their nature. First, he rejects the notion that their habits stem from natural deficiencies. As he writes here, the difference between the most dissimilar characters, between a philosopher and a common street porter, for example, seems to arise not so much from nature as from habit, custom, and education. Second, he rejects the idea that because of supposed natural deficiencies, low wages are the best method of improving the poor's habits. Smith agrees that industriousness and frugality are necessary habits for the growth of commerce, but thinks high wages do much better to encourage industriousness. It's not so much that the poor have bad habits to Smith, just that they need better motivation. Moreover, Smith thinks higher wages will allow the poor to better raise their children, so responds directly to that issue of child rearing. Third, contra Mandeville, who thought the poor should not only be kept in poverty, but also stupid, Smith endorses public education for the poor, for the adult poor, and also charity schools for their children, such that the poor can better perceive the interests of society, learn how to better perceive beyond their own interests, and so that they can gain the mental independence needed for self-command. That self-command being an important key normative ideal, as many authors have argued. Finally, and most importantly, Smith believes that a freed labor market will provide the most for the poor's economic improvement. This is the primary reason why Smith lambasted the Act of Settlement of 1662, which is one of the more famous or infamous, perhaps, bits of legislation under the English Poor Laws. And he lambasted it because it restricted labor mobility, forcing the poor to labor in parishes they were born in. And so even if the poorest beggars cannot access, he argues that even the poorest beggars can access a robust labor market, and argues that this is the best means of solving that issue with criminality, since it allows the poor to kind of escape those relations of dependency he associates with criminality. And since participating in the labor market only demands that you appeal to self-interest, the poor can reap the benefits of commerce without worrying about the problem of hard-heartedness, which as we saw, depends on their ability to persuade the rich to see beyond that hatred or sort of being rendered invisible. And so in this way, Smith thinks that for a market society to function, the poor need only inculcate a sort of commercial sociability, so long as the state also provides for the protection of property in line with his conception of negative justice. Society will be, well enough ordered such that the gains of commercial progress trickle down to those of the meanest condition. This is a necessary component of a happy society for Smith, but is it sufficient? Does Smith think it's fine to leave unaddressed the problem of hard-heartedness if the poor, at the very least, can become more prosperous than the richest African king, as he notes quite famously in The Wealth of Nations? He doesn't appear to think so. As he writes in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, quote, "And hence it is that to feel much for others and little for ourselves, that to restrain our selfish and to indulge our benevolent affections constitutes the perfection of human nature, and can alone produce among mankind that harmony of sentiments and passions in which consists their whole grace and propriety." Now, Samuel Fleischacker has used this quote to argue that the perfection of human nature consists in propriety, but I don't think this gets the quote quite right. As we see, it is instead restraining selfishness and indulging benevolence that constitutes the perfection of human nature, which is a precondition of mankind attaining that harmony of sentiments and passions. For humanity itself, as Smith states, consists, quote, in the exquisite fellow feeling which the spectator entertains with the sentiments of the persons principally concerned, so as to grieve for their sufferings, to resent their injuries, and to rejoice at their good fortune. If we couple these remarks with Smith's earlier claim that modern commercial society has been corrupted by hard-heartedness, the commercial sociability clearly isn't enough. To have a society that, quote, flourishes and is happy, that is, a society in which, quote, the different members of it are bound together by the agreeable bonds of love and affection, and are, as it were, drawn to one common center of mutual good offices, society must be based on relationships in which assistance is, quote, reciprocally afforded from love, from gratitude, from friendship, and esteem. All of these latter quotes you can find in the Theory of Moral Sentiments as well. But of course, this raises the question, how can hard-heartedness be overcome? For this, I argue that Smith's Dialectic of Sympathy is his proposed response, albeit I think a less than persuasive response. But what exactly is the Dialectic of Sympathy? This refers to the process by which individuals internalize the perspective of the impartial spectator, and it's worth underscoring from the outset that Smith marshals the precise case of the poor wretch expressing their suffering to clarify this process. I'll throw up some quotes here, but I think that I think describing it in my own terms might be a little bit more helpful. At least I'll describe it as I understand it. And so the dialectic proceeds in the following way. If me or you as a sufferer, or perhaps a poor wretch, in a way want the benevolence of an impartial spectator, you know ahead of time that they won't be inclined to enter into your sympathy unless you modulate it. You find that pitch, as he mentioned, I think in the second quote, or sorry, that first quote. Unless you find that pitch that impartial spectator will find agreeable. And so before even expressing your suffering, you already kind of know what you'll have to do rhetorically or persuasively, or rhetorically, to gain that sympathy and modulate your pitch therein. And so I think in this way, the burden to gain sympathy lies on the shoulders of the poor, or sorry, of the sufferer. And if they fail to match their pitch, their cries for help will be dismissed as pusillanimity and weakness. Again, this language comes out in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now, to be sure, this dynamic is true of all sufferers, but I argue it's more acute in the case of the poor, who must shoulder the burden of sympathy, and hence the burden of social inclusion, in the midst of all the conditions of impoverished life that Smith himself canvasses. And I think we can imagine quite easily contemporary examples of this. And so consider the various strategies we know poor folks, especially the homeless, to deploy to present themselves as deserving of our benevolence. They might wear old military garb to emphasize their status as veterans, or include just enough despair in the voice to make us feel for them without thinking they're being melodramatic. And here in New Haven, I could think of a real case where it was before COVID times. There was a homeless woman who would come to East Rock. So East Rock is just about a 20-minute walk from Yale's campus. And she would purposefully wear nicer clothes to look in a way more respectable, more deserving to the residents of East Rock, of this neighborhood. And rather than ask for money outright, she would attempt to establish herself as poor, but not that poor, by saying she needed money to pay for parking. And so I think in this, we see a poor individual moderating their pitch, moderating their suffering in order to gain and encourage that sympathy. This to me reveals the limits of sympathy as Smith understands it. Smith's conception of sympathy rightly directs our attention to important ways we exclude the poor socially, but then places the burden of inclusion squarely on the backs of the poor's ability to persuade the rich. If, as some scholars have insisted, we see Smith as a kind of recognition theorist, then we might also say that the burden of recognition is on the backs of the poor, and hence at the whims of the rich. That the rich may fail to recognize them is their problem to deal with, even if harsh menial labor has purportedly crippled their ability to use rhetoric, or at least engage in rational conversation. And so, although Smith is now appreciated and in some case championed for his keen interest in how the lives of the poor can be improved, I argue that neither his political economy nor his moral philosophy offer all that much in terms of fundamentally altering the structures of their condition. And so, for the most part, they have to rely either on the labor market or wage policy. If not that, then the Dialectic of Sympathy. but I think Smith comes out as a bit unpersuasive here. If we're looking at it somewhat cynically, but I think there's something onto it. This might be because society, in a way, needs some segment of the poor to remain impoverished if the rich are to exercise benevolence. And according to some later authors, as we'll see in a moment, fulfill Christian conceptions of duty and charity. Less cynically, but I would argue no less skeptical of the promise of commercial society, I think the ambiguous place Smith leaves us in stems from anxieties he has about transforming society. And so perhaps his remark about Rousseau being too Republican has relevance here, notwithstanding Rousseau's own political conservatism, as Richard Watmore has recently argued, I think pretty persuasively. But along these lines, Smith's framework, I think more than anything, provides the deeper moral foundations of economic liberalism. Economic liberalism, and so allowing the free market rather than state-based poor relief to improve the poor's condition, is justifiable not simply because it accords with a regime of private property, the possession of which being a sort of necessary precondition to the kind of independence necessary for political agency, these familiar sort of liberal and liberal claims, nor simply because it allows individuals, or at least those with wealth, to pursue the economic aims they so desire, and so to pursue the sort of life they might want to live. Its deeper justification, I think, lies in its ability to foster sociable relations between the rich and the poor. And in this way, rendering poverty, I'm being a little bit provocative here, so I'm not exactly sure about this, but in this way, rendering poverty more a social question than a political or perhaps even an economic one. We see this later point in a range of authors roughly around the same time as Smith and definitely after. And so as Lord Kames writes, quote, "Now to unhinge or suspend the exercise of charity by rendering it unnecessary relaxes every social virtue by supplanting the chief of them. The consequence is dismal. Exercise of benevolence to the distressed is our firmest guard against the encroachments of selfishness. If that guard be withdrawn, selfishness will prevail and become the ruling passion." Just about 10 or so, 15 or so years later, Joseph Townsend, the physician whose notions of population directly anticipate Malthus, so much so that Marx accused Malthus of plagiarizing. Townsend, I believe, Marx calls him a vulgar plagiarist in this case. Townsend concludes his dissertation on the poor laws by saying, quote, "To relieve the poor by voluntary donations is not only most wise, politic, and just, but it is most effectual in preventing misery instead of rancor, malice, and contention. The opposite and most amiable affections of the human breast, pity, compassion, and benevolence in the rich, love, reverence, and gratitude in the poor." Furthermore, the final sentence of his dissertation states, quote, "When the poor are obliged to cultivate the friendship of the rich will never want inclination to relieve the distresses of the poor." Roughly a decade or so later, in 1795, whom I would argue is in fact the arch economic liberal, Edmund Burke, indeed writes, quote, "The consideration of this, namely England's purportedly stable free market, ought to bind us all, rich and poor, together, against those wicked writers of the newspapers who would inflame the poor against their friends, guardians, patrons, and protectors." And alluding to the Enlightenment interest in manners, I'm still working out for myself how, Burke's notion of manners and his emphasis on manners, as well as other folks like Montesquieu, how all that connects with that earlier mercantilist interest in habits and manners. But that aside, he claims that, quote, statesmen ought to know the different departments of things, what belongs to the laws and what manners alone can regulate. To these, great politicians may give a leaning, but they cannot give a law. In other words, sociability by means of manners is the proper domain for addressing the poor's condition. Finally, Tocqueville writes in his memoir on pauperism that, quote, "Individual almsgiving established viable ties between the rich and the poor. A moral tie is established between, those two classes whose interests and passions so often conspire to separate them from each other." And so I'm still fleshing out this last bit, but I think looking at the moral foundations of economic liberalism from this perspective better captures its relationship to the social or to social theory. And I think in this way deepens our understanding of why these same authors might be silent to or simply outright oppose contemporary arguments for including the poor politically. Since the market provides for them economically, and the rich in a peculiar sense provide for them socially, they don't really need political agency. And at any rate, for many of these authors, poverty prevents the poor from developing the capacities need to be proper citizens in the first instance. Some of this, I think, follows from Smith. I think Keynes puts it a bit more acutely. I can say more about that in the Q&A. But for those reasons, their exclusion might make sense on those grounds as well. Okay, so that's basically all I have. So just by way of some final thoughts, I hope I have a bit more time. Let me pull back up so I can actually see where everyone is. With a little bit of time left, I can say just a little bit about where I think my next few chapters will go. And so I'm not sure if the stuff on the moral foundations of economic liberalism will be all in this first chapter. It probably will be too much. So perhaps the next chapter can be dedicated to really kind of digging into that. But of course, a burning question for all of this is, how do all these questions alter during and after the French Revolution, especially in terms of contextualizing Burke and Tocqueville. And in that case, I can see engaging with figures like Sophie de Grouchy. I'm really excited to hear the presentation on her soon. Thomas Paine, Condorcet, Robespierre, all those familiar names. And so I imagine I ought to have at least something to say about the French Revolution, not least because if my little provocation earlier that Smith kind of provides a different way of thinking about how poverty is a kind of social question, then engaging with the French Revolution I think would be necessary to that end. But I'm not sure. I'm still working on it. So after all of this, there will definitely be a chapter on Malthus, and I look forward to Nowell's forthcoming book. I'll be citing it up, down, and all around. And I'm not sure. I have some vague thoughts about maybe including Kant and Hegel somewhere. So there are possibilities, but that might take me too far into idealist grounds that maybe don't want to spend half a year trying to wade through. Well, that's all I have. I hope that's about 30 minutes or so. I really can't tell. But let me know if anything I said was unclear, and I really look forward to chatting more in the Q&A. Thanks.